So this topic is going to be about some perceptual experiences that we have, fundamental ones even, that aren't so much senses in the simplest meaning of the word, and that they don't arise directly from the firing of sensory receptors in some distinct channel of input from the ones we already know. But then we've already seen, and we'll continue to see during this course, that our perceptions, even in the traditional five senses, are not straightforwardly just a bottom-up activation of sensory receptors, but are constructed from the input of sensory receptors, often across multiple interacting senses, and combined with a bunch of top-down influences and processes, like the ways our past experience and knowledge or the context, that those things all affect what we perceive, even for the exact same sensory receptor input. So in these next few videos for this next topic, we'll be talking about things like a sense of self-recognition, a sense of bodily ownership, or a sense of embodiment. And while these won't have new receptors where we'll track the afferent pathway up to the brain and all that, instead, these are phenomena of perception, things we experience and perceive about ourselves, kind of aspects of a sort of bodily self-consciousness that arise out of a combination of input and experience with all of our other senses. So in this first video, I want to start with something pretty foundational, at least for us humans, and that's the ability to recognize ourselves as a distinct entity, to make the self a target of attention, what's sometimes been called a sense of self-recognition. Now, with adult humans, it's not so hard to confirm that someone has a sense of self-recognition because we have language. We can talk about such things directly. But what about non-linguistic entities, like non-human animals or even just babies before they can actually speak, right? How do we test whether or when they have a sense of self-recognition? Well, the most famous scientific test for self-recognition was developed back in 1970 by a researcher named Gordon Gallup, and he called it the mirror mark test. Its biggest benefit is that it's a non-linguistic test for self-recognition, so you can use it for adult humans, but also for animals and babies and so on. So how does the mirror mark test work? Well, basically you put an odorless spot, like use a little odorless dye or an odorless sticker or something like that, but you put this spot or this mark on a part of the body of the child or the animal or whatever, a part of the body that can only be seen in a mirror. And then if the creature then attends to that spot, like moves to get a better view, scratches it, tries to get it off, whatever, things like that, that would suggest that it has some rudimentary understanding of itself. When it looks in the mirror, it's not seeing a different chimpanzee or a different child, right? It's recognizing, oh, that thing in the mirror is me, not just another child or another chimp or another cat. Now, you may have seen viral videos of cats reacting to filters in a way that appears to show an understanding of mirrors, or in this case, an understanding of selfie cameras. However, despite the cuteness of it and kind of the surprise we feel when we see cute viral videos like that, that cuteness can kind of override our natural skepticism, our natural scientist inside, and we don't stop and think of all the ways this might not be what it seems. For one thing, maybe these videos are kind of selective editing, right? We don't know if they took a ton of different videos and if we're only seeing the one clip where the cat happened to act weird or funny. We also don't know if the cat was looking at the phone and looking at the human because those things were moving around and drawing attention. In other words, the cat may be looking back and forth at the two things, not because it thinks its owner suddenly has transformed into a cat, ha ha ha, but because there's some weird cat-looking stuff on the screen that draws its attention. The screen's being moved around, the person's putting it in front of their face. Okay, of course they're going to look there. And also its owner is holding it weird and acting weird, so maybe it's looking at its owner, right? This simply isn't a well-controlled scientific test, and there are lots of alternative explanations. And even more importantly, it certainly doesn't tell us anything about a cat's sense of self-recognition, the way the mirror mark test does, since the filter isn't even being applied to the cat, and the cat isn't responding by investigating its own body. Now, in fact, when we've put cats through the properly controlled mirror mark test in scientific testing, we've done this, and sure enough, cats do not pass the test. Nor do dogs. Dogs also don't pass the test. And you may be thinking, do dogs fail because they care more about smells than they do about visuals and sights? And people have indeed tried to do an olfactory version of the test, a smell version of the test, although scientists still argue about the validity of such tests. Meanwhile, despite their incredible intelligence, monkeys have also failed. Monkeys of all species tested have failed the mirror mark test. Not only that, but our favorite primate species, humans, we also fail the test, at least really early in our life. By about 1.5 years to maybe 2 years, almost all kids will start to pass the mirror mark test, suggesting that they are developing a sense of self-recognition, but we don't start with that when we first come out of the womb. So what creatures have passed the test? Well, for sure, apes have passed the mirror mark test. And that includes, of course, adult humans, but also chimpanzees, bonobos, which are pygmy chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas. They've all passed very clearly in a way that's convincing to basically all scientists. There have been experiments seeming to show dolphins and elephants and even magpies have passed the mirror mark test, although the evidence isn't as strong as it is with primates, so some people still kind of debate whether it should count or not. They're all obviously very incredibly intelligent creatures. Dolphins and elephants and corvids use tools. Like, they're very smart. The question is just, do we have good evidence that they're passing the mirror mark test in a way that's convincing of having a sense of self-recognition? And that's, like I said, there's some evidence they seem to have passed it, but some people debate whether it was a good test. And then there are somewhat more controversial claims of evidence in horses, in squids, even in ants, though the arguments there are quite a bit weaker. Or maybe you could say, if we have evidence, it's evidence of a weaker sort of self-recognition. Like, if self-recognition is more of a spectrum rather than something you have or don't have. In that sense, maybe a bacterium that has processes to distinguish itself from its environment could be argued to self-recognize in some really simple primal way. But surely that means something very different than when a human contemplates herself or thinks about her body or something like that. Just to show you here's a quick video showing an example of the mirror mark test, in this case in magpies.
Humans aren't the only ones aware of their own reflection. Birds can recognize themselves as well. Researchers have shown this for the first time by placing different colored dots on magpies' necks. The birds could only catch a glimpse of the stickers if they looked in the mirror. Here you can see a bird scratch its neck when it notices a brightly colored sticker. Some magpies tried to remove the sticker with their beaks, while others used their feet. Birds that were tagged with black spots that blended in with their feathers didn't react when they looked in the mirror.
So that bit at the end there is really important. That's a control condition, right? To show that they're not just feeling the sticker on their fur, and that's why they're trying to scratch it or move it, right? That would suggest it has nothing to do with the mirror, that they just feel the sticker. But the fact that in that control condition, when it blends in visually, they're not trying to take it off, they're not paying attention to that area, suggests it really is something. And likewise, we can do a version with a mirror or without a mirror, and again, put the sticker on. If there's no mirror there, they don't attend to it like that. So that does suggest that they're using some sort of visual there to guide their behavior. Now, interestingly, like I said, monkeys have not passed the mirror mark test in a convincing way, although with a lot of training, some monkeys can learn to use mirrors in an instrumental fashion, like to find hidden objects that are out of sight, to know how to reach around a corner or something like that using a mirror. However, they don't seem, in all these past tests, they don't seem to recognize themselves in the mirror. They just use it as a visual tool. Now, the closest evidence, the best argument for monkey self-recognition, the closest evidence probably comes from this study in 2017. What they did is they got a handful of rhesus monkeys, rhesus macaques, to pass something kind of like the mirror mark test, but only after they had specifically trained them to associate proprioceptive movement with visual feedback in a mirror. So basically, these little monkeys had their head fixated in place. Their head was kind of held in place, so they couldn't move their head around. They couldn't move their body around much. And what they did is, first, to get the monkeys used to it and just expose them to a mirror for a while, the monkeys spent 30 minutes a day for 7 days just sitting there in front of a mirror. So they'd come in for a little 30-minute session, just chill in front of a mirror. And despite that little bit of mirror experience, the monkeys totally failed the mirror mark test. Whether they used an odorless dye, like marking part of their body with a color to see if they'd attend to it, or just shining a laser pointer on part of their face, the monkeys, and despite sitting in front of the mirror, didn't do anything to like try and rub off the dye or investigate it. They didn't seem to recognize that the visual in the mirror was their own body. Then, though, the researchers spent weeks training the monkeys, specifically training the monkeys with food reward to use the mirror in order to touch where a laser pointer was on some balls next to the monkey's head that could only be seen in the mirror. So like you can see here, basically they've got these balls next to the monkey's head, and they would shine a laser pointer somewhere on those, and the monkey was trained so that it would it'd have to reach up to the side. And again, it can't see the light directly. It has to use the mirror. But by looking in the mirror, they could eventually figure out, okay, I got to move my hand over about this far to the right in order to tap that light. And when they get there, then they get a food reward. Now, after thousands of trials across weeks of practice, they were able to use that mirror instrumentally to touch the right place. But they still failed the mirror mark test. So they still failed 0%. Right, 0% mark touching in the face test after getting up there to 100% on the ball training task. So after rocking the ball training task, they still didn't have mirror self-recognition. Okay, then the researchers did a slight variation. They did the same thing with boards next to the monkey's face, but now that required a little more precise touching for the mask. So it wasn't just you had to touch the ball in general, but they had to be much more precise for the task. And after a couple weeks of training on that one, the monkeys did manage that successfully. And then finally, the researchers did the mirror mark test again. They tried shining a laser on the monkey's face, and the monkeys did often touch that location. So at that point, they are passing a mirror self-recognition, the mirror mark test. The question is whether that really shows a sense of self-recognition or whether we just gamed the system, gamed the test by sort of training them specifically to do it. But it is pretty impressive when you watch it. So here's a couple of videos from the experiment. In this first one, they'll show the ball touching condition. So first they'll show the ball touching condition and the monkey failing the mirror mark test. And then immediately after that, you'll see a 2 down here. They'll switch to the board touching condition, and then you'll see the monkey passing the mirror mark test. So now it's doing the other version, and there you go. It's passing. It's touching itself when the mirror shows the mark on itself. Now in the second video, the one on the right here, they tested those same monkeys once they got back into a different room, and they included like control conditions and stuff like putting up glass versus a mirror before marking the monkey and things like that. But here you see where they'll mark either with a laser pointer or with some dye, like they might mark part of the monkey's face or its ear with red dye, and look at how the monkeys investigate when the mirror is in front of them. So they can't see it directly, but based on what they're seeing in the mirror, based on the odorless dye on the monkey's face here, they are investigating, which suggests the thing they're seeing in the mirror is being interpreted as part of their own body, right? It's connected to that sense of bodily self. They're reaching up and saying, oh yeah, this is part of me, part of my somatosensory representation aligns with what I'm seeing visually in that mirror there. So they marked his ear in red here, and he's messing with it, trying to get it off. But the only way he knows it's there is based on looking in that mirror and seeing it. So the authors of this study, they argue monkeys do have the capacity to pass the mirror mark test if you train them a ton on intermediate behaviors, connecting its proprioception, its somatosensory info with visual input in the mirror. So some might argue that means the monkeys have the capacity for self-recognition, while others still interpret the results a little more skeptically. In fact, Gordon Gallup, the guy who invented the mirror mark test and used it to show that apes do have a sense of self-recognition, right? Not monkeys, but apes. He reviewed the literature in 2018, a couple years ago, including things like trying a smell-based version with dogs and studies like that. And he argues that really only humans and the other apes have passed the test conclusively. There's some evidence for others, but only conclusively has it been passed by apes. So as I've highlighted here at the bottom, his conclusion is that despite claims to the contrary, neither dogs, nor elephants, nor dolphins, magpies, horses, manta rays, squids, or ants have actually shown compelling and reproducible evidence for self-recognition in any modality, whether a mirror or with the smell version or whatever. That doesn't mean they don't have it, right? It doesn't prove that they don't have self-recognition, but it means we don't yet have good enough evidence to be confident in it for anything other than apes like us. Now, speaking of us humans, obviously we do have a sense of self-recognition, right? But as with many functions that our brain accomplishes, this particular ability can go wrong or have issues if certain parts of the brain are damaged, which can happen in, a stroke or traumatic brain injury, things like that. Probably the best example of problems with self-recognition is a condition called anosognosia. This is where a medical patient, usually someone who just had a stroke and is suffering some side effects, like the stroke has temporarily paralyzed half of their body or something like that. But anosognosia is where they don't recognize that they have that illness or disability. They don't recognize that half their body is paralyzed. So for example, someone's arm could be paralyzed and they'll tell you point blank, my arm works fine. I'm holding it up right now. Everything's fine. Yeah, I'm moving the arm, even though their arm isn't moving an inch. Now, they aren't delusional. They don't have any other issues with thinking or cognition. They just don't seem to have an awareness. Their brain doesn't seem to be creating an awareness of that disability. Now, I realize the name of this symptom, anosognosia, may be a little intimidating. So just to break it down to its roots, the A prefix at the front means lack of something, like someone who's asexual doesn't have sexual feelings, or someone who's an atheist lacks belief in gods. So the gnosis at the end there, that starts with a G, gnosis, that means knowledge. So someone who's agnostic lacks knowledge, right? Or if it was just those two pieces together for a brain condition, agnosia, A plus the nausea would be lack of knowledge. Sometimes people will have a lack of knowledge, and we talked about this for tactile agnosia, like someone has the inability to identify things by touch. That's an agnosia, a lack of knowledge. Well, we've also got in this word, we have that same thing. We have lack of knowledge, but we have this little noso in the middle there, and that root comes from nosology, which is the branch of medical science that deals with classifying diseases or defining what is a disease and what's not, what is a disorder and what's not. So nosology is deciding what counts as a disease or disorder, like what counts as depression, how is it classified in the DSM or things like that. So anosognosia, this condition we're talking about here, just means a lack of condition knowledge or a lack of disorder knowledge. So it makes that long term feel a little less random, hopefully. At any rate, let's see a couple examples of anosognosia in a video clip I'll show. This video clip is narrated by that Ramachandran guy, Villanor Ramachandran, who we met earlier. He came up with the mirror box treatment for phantom limb pain. Here you'll see him interviewing some patients with anosognosia.
Now, in some of these patients, when the right parietal is damaged, not only is there an indifference to the left side of the world, but also an indifference to the left side of the body, so much so they'll start denying that the left hand is paralyzed. Even though it's obviously lifeless and paralyzed and lying on their lap, they'll say, "Doctor, my left hand is not paralyzed."
This surreal complication is called anosognosia, which literally means denial of illness. In addition to his neglect, Bill Staten has anosognosia. Anosognosia damages that unique aspect of consciousness that we call the self. Patients may become wildly deluded about their abilities and even deny that parts of their own body belong to them. Ramachandran believes that anosognosia reveals how the capacity to deceive ourselves and others may have evolved in all our brains.
Mr. Staten, I'm back again. Dr. Ramachandran, I have a couple of questions for you. Can you use both your hands?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can use both your hands. Okay. Can you clap?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, that's fine. There's not the slightest flicker of movement in his left hand or his left leg. But you ask him, can he use his hands? He says yes. Or he'll say, my left hand is slightly weaker. Ask him, can you clap? He vehemently says yes. And he starts flailing his arm, and in fact patting his chest as though he was clapping.
I'll show one more clip.
Now, patients with left hemisphere damage whose right hand is paralyzed, or indeed a majority of patients with right hemisphere damage and left arm is paralyzed, will not do this. They'll say, I can't clap, doctor, my left arm is paralyzed. That's the natural response that you expect. But these patients with this extraordinary syndrome, which we call anosognosia, where the patient is denying or playing down the fact that the left arm is paralyzed. Okay. Can you show me? Can you touch my nose with your right hand? Touch my nose. Yeah. Excellent. Now, can you do it with your left hand, please?
I think so.
Okay. Can you do it for me?
I'll try.
Okay, that's fine. Are you doing it?
Wait a minute. I'm calling up my left hand.
You're calling it up? Okay.
Get in there.
Okay. All right. Is it touching my left?
No.
My nose?
Yeah, I'm still talking to it.
You're still talking to it?
I'm explaining to it what to do.
You're explaining to it what to do. Okay. Is it listening?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
But it's reacting slowly.
It's reacting slowly. Okay.
It's tired, I think.
It's tired. Okay. Thank you very much. Many of these patients, the remarks they make to account for the left hand's failure to perform, the statements they make often sound a little bit humorous, often tinged with a perverse sense of humor. And you start wondering about some of Freud's ideas about humor itself being used as a defense mechanism. Is that what the patient doing?
Ella Sinclair is another stroke victim with a paralysed left side. She also has anosognosia, and she too seems to use humour to deny her paralysis.
Now you remember when I first saw you, I was asking you whether you could use your left hand. What did you tell me then?
I think I told you yes,
You told me yes, you could use it.
but I lied.
You lied. Well, why did you lie to me?
I don't know, you wasn't smiling at me, I guess.
Because I was smiling at you?
You were not.
I was not smiling at you. Okay, so that's why you were lying. Okay. But you remember you said that several times. I kept asking you. And you always said you could use your left hand fine, that there was no problem.
Before I had my stroke, I could, but I can't now.
You can't now.
One of Mrs. Sinclair's comments was so odd that it was hard to know whether she was joking or not.
The other striking thing we saw in Mrs. Sinclair, when we held her right hand up to her and asked her, whose hand is it? She said, it's my hand. When I held her left hand up in front of her, she said, that's my husband's hand. And she remembers vividly seeing her husband's hand. Do you remember at that time I showed you your hand? Did I show you anybody else's hand?
Yeah, you showed me my husband's hand.
I showed you your husband's hand. You remember that clearly, do you?
Yeah,
Okay.
I've been living with him 27 years, I know his hand.
You know where his hand is. You've been with him for so many years. That's true, yes. We never showed her husband's hand. In fact, he was not even in the room.
So it's sad to watch, and thankfully this often improves with time as the brain heals or with extensive rehabilitation. One thing you can note at the end of this, the lady in her later interview had developed an awareness of her stroke. The anosognosia had passed. She was aware of the stroke and its effect on her hand. Whereas initially, they're referring back to the earlier interview, which they hadn't actually recorded, but initially she didn't have that insight into her condition. So anosognosia may often be temporary, thankfully. Now, one thing you may have noticed Ramachandran mention is that it mostly occurs only when a stroke has damaged part of the parietal lobe on the right hemisphere. It doesn't seem to happen with left hemisphere damage. So, if the stroke was in the right hemisphere of the brain, which arm would you expect to be paralyzed and to have those issues sensing it as your own? Well, it would be the left arm, or it could be the left leg, but the left side of the body, it would be that side because of the contralateral wiring of our brains. Each hemisphere controls and gets sensory info from the opposite side of the body. So right hemisphere stroke would cause problems with the left side of the body. But why? Why in the world does it sometimes happen with this damage to certain parts of the right hemisphere, but not when the corresponding location in the left hemisphere is damaged? Let's try and solve this mystery. Well, The biggest clue to help make sense of this requires knowing a little something about the brain, something we actually learned back in our short little neuroscience primer topic. We know that humans are not left-brained or right-brained. That's a common misconception, but that certain functions are more heavily processed on one side of the brain. Certain tasks that we do are more specific to one hemisphere or the other. And at that time, in that previous video, I mentioned that the left hemisphere is more language specialized, more involved in the widespread brain network that's active during all sorts of language tasks. So how does this explain anosognosia happening only when the right hemisphere is damaged? Well, for that, we need to know a little about research done decades back on split brain patients. People who had their corpus callosum severed, so that little connecting part in the middle of the brain. They had it severed often during surgery to treat intractable epilepsy, like it's kind of a last case scenario. We'll try severing this so that the epilepsy, the seizures don't spread across the whole brain. These people who have the corpus callosum severed, these split brain patients, they still have both hemispheres of the brain, but no connection to send that info back and forth. As we know, or we know that, due to the contralateral wiring of the brain, the visual input in the right visual field goes to the left half of the brain, the left hemisphere, and things in the left visual field go to the right half of the brain, the right hemisphere, like you can see in the picture here. But with split brain patients, that info then doesn't get shared across the brain. They can't combine that information, share it with the other side. So what was done in some early research on split brain patients, they would sit them down in front of a screen like this, have them fixate at the center without moving their eyes, and then flash them pictures on the left and the right, in the left and the right peripheries. So in this example here, we show a chicken foot off in their right periphery and a snowy field off in their left periphery. And you can see how those visual inputs end up going to the opposite side of their brain, in the occipital lobe at the back of the brain, but things in the right visual field go to the left hemisphere of the brain, and vice versa. So what does the left hemisphere of the brain see? Well, the left hemisphere of the brain sees a chicken foot, right? Because that's all the info that side of the brain has access to, things in the right visual field. Then, after you briefly flash these pictures on the screen, what you might do is ask the split brain patient, ask this person, hey, could you use your right hand to pick out an object from all these objects or other pictures on the table or whatever, and now they can just look around freely. But you might ask them, use your right hand to pick out an object that matches what you saw on the screen a moment ago, whatever flashed a moment ago on the screen. And their right hand, which again is controlled by the left side of the brain, is going to pick up, of all these things, it would pick up the picture of a chicken, right? Because that's what the left hemisphere of the brain saw, was a chicken's foot. So of course it's going to pick a chicken as matching most closely. That makes sense. Now, if instead you ask them to use their left hand, so tell them from this array of objects or pictures or whatever, grab with your left hand the one that matches what you saw. Remember, the left hand over here is controlled by the right hemisphere of the brain, and the right hemisphere saw the snowy field. So the left hand picks up the shovel, right? Shovel goes with snow. That makes sense. That's all the right hemisphere had access to, is a snowy scene. Shovel goes with snow. Okay. Nothing weird yet. But here's where it gets really interesting. When they grab the shovel with their left hand, because the right brain only knows about the snowy picture, so they grab the shovel with the left hand when you ask that. Then you ask them out loud, so using language, you ask them, why did you pick the shovel? So on the trial where you told them to use their left hand, they grab the shovel, and you say, why? Why did you pick the shovel? Now, which hemisphere is it that's going to answer your verbalized question? It's the left hemisphere, the language hemisphere. And that speaking left hemisphere has only seen the chicken foot. So the answer they give is kind of hilarious. They'll say, like, they picked up the shovel because you can use it to pick up chicken poop. They're saying they chose the shovel as the best match for their chicken foot picture, even though there's a freaking chicken picture they could have picked that's a better match. Basically, their brain, in this case, the linguistic left hemisphere of the brain, it makes up a story. It makes something up after the fact to try and explain the behavior of a separate entity, right? The behavior of the right hemisphere that picked out the shovel, but it doesn't have access to what the right hemisphere knows. So it doesn't know why the right hemisphere, why that hand picked out the shovel, but it tries to make sense of it based on the information it has. So the left hemisphere explanation sounds kind of silly. It's nonsensical. It makes us laugh, kind of like Ramachandran was saying sometimes what people talk about with anosognosia makes us laugh. But this making up of a story after the fact to try and make sense of the available information, that's called confabulation. It's a symptom that occurs in other conditions, like in certain memory disorders where people will make up stories to fill in the gaps of their memory. And it can happen in dementia pretty commonly, stuff like that too. But in the case of the split brain patient, we can see exactly why it might happen. In this case, the part of the brain only knows this much information, right? The left hemisphere that can speak and answer us verbally only knows this much information. So it has to make sense of this new piece. Like, okay, now I've grabbed the shovel and I saw a chicken foot. I've grabbed the shovel, I saw a chicken foot. Let's make sense of that. And they make up the kind of silly sounding reason. So now that we've learned from these split brain patients, or what we've learned from these split brain patients, is that the left hemisphere is the linguistic side. It's the speaking side. That's how we learned. That's like the kind of earliest evidence for the left hemisphere being specialized for language. It's got this specialized role. And now we can see it also has this tendency to confabulate, a tendency to shoehorn the available data into a nice little explanatory package. I picked the shovel as matching the chicken foot because you would need it to scoop up the poop. Sure, makes sense after the fact. Now, research coming out of this sort of split brain work has led to a broader hypothesis about a more general role for the two hemispheres of the brain. So in this hypothesis, the left hemisphere works as a sort of status quo. It tries to make everything fit one coherent narrative, which means it'll also confabulate. Right? Now, the right hemisphere then might be thought of as a sort of devil's advocate. It makes reality checks. It tries to update the representation when things change, when new information comes in. The right hemisphere then is the side that would normally notice if your hand was paralyzed and would update your brain's awareness of your hand as being paralyzed. But in these anosognosia patients that we saw, they've had a stroke to part of the right hemisphere. So the right hemisphere, that part, can't do its usual reality testing job. Whereas the left hemisphere, it's fine, it's fully functional, it's happy to tell its neat little stories, to give simple explanations for whatever is currently happening. Like the guy saying he called up its hand and it's just being slow to move, that it works just fine, just give it a second. Here's actually another short video clip continuing from that last one, where Ramachandran explains this hypothesis in his words.
Now, to understand what's going on in these patients, you have to look at the left and right cerebral hemispheres of the brain. Now, everyone realizes, of course, that there's specialization. The left hemisphere is specialized for language, and the right hemisphere is thought to be specialized for seeing faces, seeing facial expression, and to some extent for emotions. But I think there's an even more fundamental distinction between the two cerebral hemispheres, and that might help explain this peculiar syndrome you're seeing in these patients. There is a tremendous need in each one of us to create a coherent belief system to maintain a sense of continuity to our own lives. And this is done largely by the left hemisphere, this creation of a belief system. And when there are new experiences, the left hemisphere folds these experiences into the pre-existing belief system. If something doesn't quite fit the story, the strategy of the left hemisphere is to deny the anomaly, is to pretend it doesn't exist, is to brush it under the carpet. And this is what we call denial. Now, counterbalancing this is the right hemisphere, which has the opposite tendency. Whereas the left hemisphere tries to preserve the model, preserve the belief system, preserve status quo, the right hemisphere is your devil's advocate, constantly challenging the status quo. And when the discrepancy or anomaly becomes unbearably large, or becomes too large, then the right hemisphere forces a complete revision in your worldview, in your belief system. Now, what has happened in these patients is the left hemisphere is intact, so it's engaging in denial, as it does in normal people, but she doesn't have a counterbalance. There's no right hemisphere challenging the story, doing a reality check, and therefore they become more and more deeply delusional, and in fact there is no limit to the delusions that you can elicit, including a claim that her arm belongs to her husband, or saying, yes, I can see my finger touch your nose.
So you can see how anosognosia is a good example of the sense of self-recognition going wrong. But studying it helps us understand more general principles about how the sense of self is created and maintained in the normal, healthy brain, including insights into possible distinct roles for like the left and the right hemispheres. We'll come back to this stuff later. As a quick side note, there's one very rare subtype of anosognosia that can happen when someone loses their vision due to damage to the occipital lobe, the visual part at the back of the brain. So damage to the occipital lobe can cause a type of blindness. Makes sense. The visual part of your brain's damaged. You won't see things. You won't experience things. So it's a type of blindness called cortical blindness. Cortical because it's damage to the cerebral cortex, not due to damage to the eyes, right? That would be another way of going blind, is just your eyes don't work. This is the visual part of the brain doesn't work. Both of those cause you to go blind. This is cortical blindness. And while cortical blindness can happen with a lot of things like a major stroke to the occipital area, there's a very rare type of anosognosia that has occasionally shown up as a side effect in some people who have cortical blindness. Barely more than a couple dozen people have had this, and it's called Anton syndrome, or sometimes just called visual anosognosia. But in Anton syndrome, in this condition, a person who has gone blind due to cortical blindness, so gone blind because their occipital lobe got damaged by a stroke or something like that, they don't actually realize they're blind. They think they're not blind, they claim they're not blind, they don't realize it. That's why it's an anosognosia. So they will run into chairs and walls, all while saying that they see just fine. And that means they confabulate. They make up stories to explain why they just ran into the wall or the closed door. And again, it's not that they're messing with you as a joke. They're not lying because they themselves don't realize that they're blind. And it's not that they're generally delusional or losing it in general, since their cognitive functions tend to be preserved overall. They just don't have something clicking that develops an awareness of their disability. So their left hemisphere comes up with some tidy little stories to explain why they're bumping into things. It confabulates. I find it one of the most interesting examples of anosognosia, and we will come back to talk about cortical blindness later in the course. For now, though, that's a good point to move on from the sense of self-recognition, and then in the next video, we'll talk about something kind of related to it, the sense of bodily ownership, or just the sense of ownership, the perception that your body and its limbs are part of you.